The box hit the porch floor so hard it rattled the weathered planks beneath Lydia Reed's bare feet, and when she looked up from the sound, she found herself staring at a man she had spent 2 years trying to forget. Benjamin Graves stood at the foot of her porch steps with his hat in his hands, and his dark eyes full of something she had no name for, something that lived between shame and desperation, and a kind of hollow grief that made her breath catch despite every wall she had built since the last time she had seen his face. He was thinner than she remembered, and there was a new scar running along his jaw that hadn't been there before, and the collar of his coat was frayed at the edges in a way that told her the road had not been kind to him. None of that mattered. What mattered was the box. She knew the box. She had packed it herself 2 years ago, in the hours after the telegram arrived telling her that her husband Thomas Reed was dead, and that the man who had been riding with him, Benjamin Graves, known outlaw, wanted in 3 territories, had walked away from the ambush that killed him. She had packed that box in the blinding white silence of shock, and she had locked it, and she had buried the key in the garden behind the house, and somehow this man standing in front of her with his hollow eyes and his frayed collar had it. "You have no right," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. She had imagined this moment dozens of times in the sleepless dark of the past 2 years, and in every version of it she had screamed. She hadn't expected the quiet. "You have no right to have that." "No," Benjamin Graves said. His voice was the same as she remembered, low, deliberate, each word placed with the care of a man who had learned that careless words cost lives. "No, I don't." He did not move to come up the steps. He did not reach for the box. He just stood there with his hat in his hands and let her look at him with all the fury and grief and confused betrayal she had been storing up since the day she learned his name. "Then why do you have it?" she asked. "Because Thomas gave it to me," he said. "And I didn't know what to do with that, and I held on to it longer than I should have, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for all of it, but I'm here now." Lydia looked at the box. She looked at the man. 2 years of anger rose in her chest like floodwater, and underneath it, like a stone she could not move, was the knowledge that Thomas had trusted this man enough to hand him the most important thing she owned, which meant that somewhere in the story she had been telling herself since the day she buried her husband, there was a hidden truth she had not yet found. She sat down on the porch step without deciding to, the wood rough and warm against the backs of her thighs through her work dress, and she pressed her palms flat against her knees to keep her hands from shaking. "Sit down," she said, "and tell me everything." She did not know in that moment that she was saying those words not just to an outlaw returning stolen property, but to the man who would become the great love of her life. She would not know that for some time yet. The town of Cutter's Bend, New Mexico Territory, in the summer of 1882, was a place held together by the thinnest possible wire of law. The railroad had come through 3 years prior and brought with it the usual collection of gamblers, land speculators, and men with dark pasts, looking to reinvent themselves in the dust and silence of the desert Southwest. The honest settlers, the farmers, the ranchers, the women who hung their laundry in the hot wind and built their lives stitch by careful stitch, existed in a kind of perpetual negotiation with the lawless energy that the railroad had imported along with its passengers and its promises. Lydia Reed had come to Cutter's Bend 4 years ago as the wife of Thomas Reed, who had been a surveyor by training and a dreamer by nature. Thomas had believed in the territory the way some men believe in God, with a faith that outlasted every piece of contradicting evidence. He had bought 40 acres of scrubby land northeast of town and spent 2 years coaxing wheat and barley out of the stubborn soil, and Lydia had loved him for his stubbornness even when it exhausted her. She had loved him for his belief in things. Thomas Reed had met Benjamin Graves at a card table in Albuquerque in the spring of 1880, which was approximately the most Thomas Reed thing that had ever happened to Thomas Reed. Thomas was not a gambling man by habit, but he had been in Albuquerque for a surveying job and had wandered into a saloon out of curiosity, and found himself in a poker game, he didn't know how to leave without embarrassing himself. Benjamin Graves had been at that table. Benjamin Graves had been at many such tables in those years. What Thomas had told Lydia about Benjamin Graves, across the kitchen table over the following months, had been delivered in the careful installments of a man who knows his wife is already skeptical and is trying to build a case. Benjamin Graves was not a bad man, Thomas had said. He had made bad choices, Thomas had said. He had fallen in with the Calvert outfit when he was 19 and fresh off a cattle drive with nothing in his pockets, and a talent for horses that the Calverts had recognized and exploited. And by the time he understood the full shape of what he had gotten himself into, the shape had already molded itself around him. Lydia had listened to all of this with the careful attention of a woman who loves her husband enough to hear out his judgment, even when she questions it. She had not trusted Benjamin Graves. She had met him twice in those first 2 years, once when Thomas brought him to the farm for a meal, and once when she had encountered them both in town, and both times she had felt the same thing, a discomfort that she could not explain precisely, a sense that Benjamin Graves was a man around whom the ordinary rules of the world bent in ways she couldn't predict. He was not threatening, exactly. He was not rude. He was, if anything, too careful with her, too deliberate in his courtesy, too measured in everything he said, as though he was constantly aware of being watched and judged, and had long ago accepted that the verdict would not go in his favor. She had not been cruel to him. She was not a cruel woman, but she had kept her distance, and she had watched the way Thomas's face lit up in Benjamin's company with a mixture of affection and unease that she could not entirely separate from jealousy. And then the telegram had come. April of 1882. Thomas had been riding with Benjamin Graves on a supply run to the town of San Marcos, 40 miles south, a trip they had made 3 times before without incident. What neither of them had known was that the Calvert outfit, the same men Benjamin had ridden with years ago, the same men who still carried his name on their roster in their own private accounting of loyalties, had heard he was in the territory and had decided that his continued survival constituted a security risk. The ambush had happened 8 miles outside of San Marcos, in a narrow canyon that the locals called the Needle. 3 men from the Calvert outfit had waited there with rifles. Thomas Reed had been shot twice and had died before they could get him clear of the canyon. Benjamin Graves had survived. The official report, filed by the deputy who found the scene, noted that Benjamin Graves had managed to drive off 2 of the attackers and that the 3rd had fled. It noted that he had stayed with Thomas Reed's body until help arrived. It noted that he was wanted in connection with a stage robbery in Arizona territory from 2 years prior and had subsequently evaded arrest. What the official report did not mention, what Lydia had not known until Benjamin Graves appeared on her porch 2 years later with a box in his hands, was that in the minutes before Thomas Reed died in that canyon, he had given Benjamin something. Lydia sat on the porch step with the late afternoon light turning everything amber and red, and she listened. Benjamin Graves sat on the lowest step, his hat on his knee, and he told her the truth. All of it. He told it the way he did everything carefully, without ornament, placing each piece of the story where it belonged as though he was afraid that if he arranged it wrong, she would miss the thing he most needed her to understand. He told her that Thomas had known, in the last minutes, that he was not going to survive. He told her that Thomas had reached into the inside pocket of his coat, the coat he always wore, the brown one with the brass buttons that Lydia had mended at the left elbow the winter before, and pulled out a small iron key and placed it in Benjamin's hand. He told her that Thomas had said, "There's a box on the farm. The key opens it. Make sure Lydia gets it. Make sure she knows I kept my promise." He told her that he had taken the key because Thomas was dying and he would have done anything Thomas asked of him in that moment, and that afterward, when he was running from the law and trying to stay alive, the key had become a kind of anchor, a promise he carried and could not yet keep. He told her he had thought about sending it. He had thought about a dozen ways of getting it to her without coming himself, but none of them felt right. None of them felt like what Thomas had actually asked him to do. He said, "Make sure she knows," Benjamin said. "That meant I had to come. It meant I had to tell you." Lydia looked at the box sitting on the porch planks beside her. She reached out and picked it up. It was heavier than she remembered, or maybe her arms were just tired from the summer of working the farm alone. "Where did you get the key?" she asked, though she already knew. Benjamin reached into his coat pocket and held it out to her. A small iron key, slightly worn at the teeth from years in a pocket. She took it from his hand without touching his fingers, which required a small and precise act of will. She opened the box. Inside was a letter in Thomas's handwriting. Beneath the letter was a small leather pouch that she recognized, and beneath that was a thin gold ring, not her wedding ring, which she still wore, but a second ring, a slightly heavier band that she had not seen before. And beneath the ring was a folded paper that turned out to be the deed to the 40 acres, with a notation in the margin in Thomas's careful surveyor's script, for Lydia, her land, her name, always. The letter was short. It said, "Lydia, I know I haven't always been as careful with us as I should have been. I know you've worried about the company I keep. I know you've been patient when patience cost you something. The ring belonged to my mother, and I always meant to give it to you properly, with a speech I never managed to write. The deed is in your name now. I made sure of it last month. If anything happens, the land is yours and no one can take it. If I send this with Ben, it's because I trust him with the things that matter most to me, and you are the thing that matters most to me. Tell him I said so. He won't believe it otherwise. All my love always, Thomas." Lydia read the letter twice. Then she folded it very carefully and placed it back in the box, and set the box on the step beside her, and sat very still for a long time. The sun was moving toward the mesa to the west. The desert light was doing that thing it did in the late afternoon, where everything looked like it was made of copper and fire. Benjamin Graves had not moved. He sat on the lowest step with his hat on his knee and his eyes on the middle distance, giving her the silence because he understood, she realized, that she needed it. "He trusted you," she finally said. "He was the best man I ever knew," Benjamin said. "And I have spent 2 years trying to be less of a reason why he's dead." That sentence went through Lydia like a blade. Not because it was meant to hurt her, but because it was so plainly true, not the reality of it, which was that the Calvert outfit had killed Thomas, not Benjamin, but the emotional weight of it, which was something she recognized. She had spent 2 years carrying the same irrational, grinding guilt. Wondering if she had been warmer, more supportive, less anxious about his friendship with an outlaw, whether Thomas would have been different, would have been less inclined toward the kind of adventure that had put him in that canyon. She knew it was irrational. Grief frequently was. "You didn't kill him," she said. "No," Benjamin said. "But I was why they were there." She did not argue with that because they both knew it was true, and there was a dignity in not arguing with true things. The silence stretched between them, and in the silence Lydia noticed, with a start of awareness that embarrassed her, that she was not only grieving. She was also looking at this man on her porch step, and feeling something she had absolutely no right to feel and no desire to examine, something that lived in the same strange country as the discomfort she had always felt in his presence. Only now she could read the compass better, and what it was pointing toward was not discomfort at all. She stood up and picked up the box. "I'll make supper," she said. "You look like you haven't eaten properly in a week." Benjamin looked up at her with the expression of a man who has come expecting a door slammed in his face and has received something so different from that expectation that he cannot immediately process it. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know I don't," she said. "Come inside." She did not examine why she said it. She simply said it and turned and went into the house, and after a moment she heard his boots on the porch steps behind her. The farmhouse was small and clean, and bore all the marks of a woman who had been living alone for 2 years in a place that required constant work to maintain. The furniture was simple: a pine table, 4 chairs that didn't quite match, a cast iron stove that dominated the kitchen, a shelf of books against one wall that were obviously well read. There were dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beam, and a quilt over the back of one chair, and a pair of work gloves on the table beside a surveying map that Lydia had apparently been in the middle of studying when Benjamin arrived. He stood just inside the door while she fed wood into the stove, and he noticed all of these things with the attention of a man who had spent years in places that felt like nowhere, and was suddenly in a place that felt absolutely, completely like somewhere. "You're working the survey work yourself," he said, looking at the map. "Someone has to know where the property lines are," Lydia said, not looking up from the stove. "The neighbor to the east has been pushing his fence west for 2 years. I need to know the exact legal boundary. Thomas's tools, Thomas's tools, Thomas's books. I taught myself from them over the winter." She finally turned to look at him. "Did you think I wouldn't manage?" "No," he said. "I always thought you would." He said it simply, without flattery, as though it was simply an observed fact that he had noted some time ago and filed away. Something moved in her chest at that. She ignored it. She made cornbread and heated the beans she had prepared that morning and fried up the last of the salt pork, and it was plain food and simple, the food of someone who fed themselves without ceremony, because ceremony required 2 people, and she had been one for long enough. Benjamin ate without complaining, which she respected, and he didn't try to fill the silence with meaningless talk, which she respected more. After supper, she poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the back of the stove and sat down across the table from him. "The Calverts," she said. "Are they still looking for you?" He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Yes." "Are they likely to follow you here?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was careful coming," he said. "I came through the territory from the west. I didn't come through San Marcos or Albuquerque, but I won't pretend there's no risk in my being here." "You should have thought of that before you came," she said. "I should have thought of a lot of things," he said. "But I made a promise to a dying man and I kept it. I'll deal with the rest." Lydia looked at him across the table. In the lamplight, he looked different than he had outside, less like a wanted man, and more like a very tired human being who had been carrying something heavy for a long time. The scar along his jaw caught the light when he turned his head. "How did you get that?" she asked, gesturing at the scar. He touched it briefly, almost without thinking. "Knife fight in a cantina outside of El Paso 8 months ago. I was trying to get away from 2 men the Calverts sent." "Did you win?" A very small, very compressed smile. It changed his face entirely, opened something in it that the careful blankness usually kept closed. "I got away," he said. "Whether that counts as winning depends on your definitions." She found herself almost smiling back and caught herself and looked down at her coffee cup. "I need you to tell me what happened in the canyon," she said. "Not the official version. What actually happened?" He told her. He told her the whole of it, with the same careful precision he had used before, and this time she was able to hear it differently, not as a betrayal narrative, not as the story of how an outlaw's past had cost her husband, but as the story of what had actually occurred. 3 men in the canyon. Thomas's horse going down first. Benjamin pulling Thomas behind the rocks and taking a rifle ball in the shoulder that he hadn't mentioned before, which she only discovered because he described the way the recoil of his own shot had gone wrong because of it. He had driven off 2 of them with sustained fire while trying to keep Thomas calm. The third had run when it became clear the ambush had not achieved what it was supposed to achieve. Thomas had been hit in the initial volley. There was nothing Benjamin could have done differently that would have changed that. She had known this intellectually, from the deputy's report, for 2 years. But hearing it from the man who had been there, hearing the specific sounds and moments, and the weight of Thomas's hand in his as he died made it real in a different way, made it settled. Like a bone that had been broken and badly set for a long time, and was now being set correctly, which hurt more than the original fracture had but would heal cleaner. She cried. She had not intended to, and she did not do it dramatically, but the tears came with the kind of quiet inevitability that she recognized as the final processing of something she had not been able to fully grieve because she had not had the whole story. Benjamin did not say anything. He did not reach across the table. He sat with his hands around his coffee cup and was present, which was the right thing, and she was obscurely grateful for his instinct about it. When she was done, she wiped her face with the hem of her apron and said, "You're going to need somewhere to sleep." He looked at her. "The barn," she said. "I have a spare stall that's clean. It's no hotel, but it's better than the open desert." "I wasn't expecting, I know you weren't," she said, "but Thomas asked you to make sure I knew he kept his promise. He kept his promise. You kept yours. That earns you a night out of the weather." She stood up and carried the coffee cups to the basin. "I'll get you a blanket." He stayed in the barn that first night, and in the morning when she came out to do the feeding she found that he had already done it. The horses watered and fed, the stall cleaned, a small neat pile of split wood beside the barn door that he had obviously cut from the stack along the fence line at some point before dawn. He was sitting on the fence rail looking at the eastern sky, which was doing its early morning spectacle of orange and gold above the mesa, and when she came out he got down off the fence and stood with his hands in his pockets. "You didn't have to do all that," she said. "I woke up early," he said. "I needed something to do with my hands." She looked at the wood pile and the open barn and the horses looking placidly out over their stall doors. "Are you in any hurry to leave?" she asked. The question surprised him. She could see it. "I don't have any particular place to be," he said, which was, she thought, probably one of the sadder sentences she had ever heard, delivered in a tone so neutral it was clear he had long since made his peace with the truth of it. "The fence line on the east side needs mending," she said. "It's been half done since spring. I haven't had the time to get to it. If you're willing to work, you can stay until it's done." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him weighing things, danger against need, his risk against her practical reality, the wisdom of staying in one place against the hunger she suspected he had for a place to be. "I can mend a fence," he said. "Good," she said. Breakfast in 20 minutes. That was how it began. Not with a declaration or a dramatic moment, but with a fence line and a practical need, and two people in the early morning light finding a reason to stay in the same place for a little while longer. The work was real and it was constant. The farm demanded everything from anyone who tried to maintain it, and in those weeks of late summer 1882, it demanded the same from Benjamin Graves as it had always demanded from Lydia Reed. He mended the east fence and then the north one, where 3 posts had rotted out at the base. He repaired the barn roof, which had been leaking in the northwest corner since the spring rains, climbing up there with a roll of roofing material and a hammer, and working in the direct heat of the July sun without complaint. He helped bring in the barley from the south field, the two of them working in silent coordination through the blazing afternoons, and what he did not know about farming he learned quickly, watching her and adjusting. He was good with his hands. She had not known this about him, but it made sense. A man who had spent years surviving on his own in the territory would have had to be good with his hands. He could fix things, a deep and practical competence that expressed itself not in showing off, but in simply looking at a broken thing long enough to understand it and then fixing it. She found this unexpectedly moving. She was good with her mind. He had suspected this about her from the surveying map on the table, but the full extent of it became clear as the weeks passed. She could do the mental arithmetic of the farm, the accounts, the water calculations, the crop rotations in her head while doing something else entirely, running numbers in the background the way some people hum without knowing it. She had a method for everything, and the methods were thoughtful and efficient, refined by years of doing things without enough help. They were not easy with each other at first. There was too much history in the space between them for ease, Thomas's memory, the guilt they both carried, the strangeness of their situation. The fact that every morning when Lydia woke up she had to consciously reorient herself to a world in which Benjamin Graves was sleeping in her barn and eating at her table and was gradually becoming, against every expectation, someone she looked forward to seeing. The conversations came slowly, the way genuine conversations do between people who have reasons to be careful, but they came. One evening in the third week, sitting on the porch after supper in the blue cooling air of a New Mexico evening, she asked him about his family. "I don't have any," he said, not with self-pity, just with the flat accuracy of a man reporting a fact. "My mother died when I was 12. My father wasn't around much. I had a sister. She married and moved to Kansas in '76. We lost touch. You haven't tried to find her. I have a price on my head in Kansas as well as Arizona," he said. It didn't seem fair to her. Lydia thought about that. About all the things he had quietly stepped away from because they would cost other people something. "You've spent a long time protecting strangers," she said. He looked at her sidelong. "What do you mean?" "I mean Thomas. You stayed with him when you could have run. You came here when you could have sent the key through anyone. Your sister, who you're staying away from to protect." That's just doing what's right," he said. "A lot of men have a longer list of what's right when it comes to themselves," she said. He was quiet. The evening wind moved through the desert brush beyond the fence line with a soft sound like breathing. "Tell me about Thomas," she said. "Things I might not know." So he told her. He told her about the card game in Albuquerque, and how Thomas had been so transparently out of his depth at the poker table that Benjamin had taken mercy on him and quietly let him win a hand just to save him from total embarrassment. And Thomas had been so obviously delighted about winning that Benjamin hadn't had the heart to tell him. He told her about the time Thomas had found a hawk with a broken wing on the road outside of San Marcos, and had spent 3 days in a barn nursing it before it could fly again, arguing with it in a patient, reasonable tone, as though the hawk could be persuaded through logic to eat. He told her how Thomas had talked about her, how often and with what absolute certainty, the way Thomas had said Lydia says, and Lydia thinks, as though her opinions were reference points as reliable as the stars he used for surveying. She laughed twice during this recounting, real laughter, helpless and warm, the kind that came up from somewhere underneath the grief and lived there alongside it rather than replacing it. Benjamin watched her laugh with an expression she could not immediately interpret, but that she would later understand as the look of a man falling in love with something he does not believe he has the right to even want. "He talked about you constantly," she said. "I didn't know it went both ways. He was my best friend," Benjamin said simply. "I didn't have many of those. And now," a pause, "and now I'm trying to figure out who I am when I'm not running," he said. That sentence lodged in her somewhere. She thought about it later, lying awake in the dark of her bedroom with the desert silence around her, and she thought about the fact that she was doing the same thing, trying to figure out who she was when she was not grieving, not managing alone, not bracing herself for the next blow. It was strange, this parallel reconstruction of self. It was strange how much she recognized of her own condition in his. She was not falling in love with him. She was absolutely not falling in love with him. She was a recent widow, 2 years was recent, in the mathematics of real grief, and he was an outlaw with a price on his head and a past that had already cost her the person she loved most, and none of this was appropriate or sensible. She told herself this with great firmness every morning for the next 2 weeks and believed it less every day. The letter from the land office in Albuquerque arrived in the first week of August, and it was a problem. Lydia had expected it to be routine, a confirmation of the deed transfer that Thomas had made, the paperwork completing what Thomas had started. Instead, it was a notification of a challenge to the deed, filed by a man named Harlan Voss, who claimed that Thomas Reed had used fraudulent survey data to establish the eastern boundary of the property, and that the correct boundary placed nearly 12 acres of the most productive farmland inside Voss's claim rather than Reed's. She read the letter twice at the kitchen table, and then she spread the survey maps Thomas had left and looked at them. And then she sat very still and thought. Benjamin came in from the barn while she was thinking and saw the maps on the table and the expression on her face. "What's wrong?" she told him. He pulled out a chair and sat down and looked at the maps and the letter. "Is he right?" Benjamin asked. "About the boundary?" "No," she said. "The boundary is where Thomas put it. I've been over these surveys 4 times since spring and they are accurate. Voss is wrong." She paused. "Or he knows he's wrong and is counting on me not being able to prove it." "What do you need to prove it?" "I need to go to Albuquerque," she said. "I need to file a response with the land office and bring the original survey documentation and make the case in person. I have 30 days. "I'll take you," he said. She looked at him. "Albuquerque is not the safest place for you." "No," he said. "But you can't make that ride alone and then navigate the land office alone. I can be careful." "Being careful in Albuquerque with your face is not as simple as you're making it sound." "I know what I look like on a wanted poster," he said. "I've seen enough of them. Albuquerque is a big city now. If I'm careful about where I go, the risk is manageable." She studied him for a moment. He met her eyes steadily, and there was something in his expression that went beyond practicality, a quiet determination, an unwillingness to let her face this alone, that was so plainly sincere that arguing with it felt perverse. "We leave in 3 days," she said. "I need to prepare the documents." She spent the next 3 days organizing Thomas's survey notes, cross-referencing them with the original land grant maps she had obtained from the Territorial Records Office in Santa Fe by mail the previous year, and building a case that was as tight as she could make it. She worked at the kitchen table in the evenings with the lamp burning late, and Benjamin left her to it but appeared periodically with coffee and once, memorably, with a plate of cornbread he had made himself, slightly lopsided but edible, which he set beside her without comment and retreated. She had not asked him to do that. He had simply noticed she hadn't eaten and had done something about it. The simplicity of the care, the unasked, unannounced quality of it, made her put down her pencil and sit for a moment feeling something she was not ready to name. They left for Albuquerque early on a Thursday morning in August, Lydia driving the buckboard with the document case under the seat and Benjamin riding alongside on the bay horse he had arrived on, wearing a plain coat and a hat pulled lower than usual. The journey was 2 days with a night at a small road ranch between the farm and the city, and the road ranch was owned by a Tejano family named Ortega who greeted Lydia by name, and fed them both generously and asked no questions about Benjamin, which was either good manners or good instinct or both. That night at the road ranch, sitting on the bench outside the main building in the cooling desert night, while the Ortega's children's voices carried from inside, Benjamin told her about the stage robbery in Arizona. The one he was wanted for. He told it without being asked. She had been watching the stars appear one by one above the mesa, and he had been quiet for a long time, and then he said, "You should know what I actually did, so you're not guessing." He told her that the robbery had happened in the spring of 1880, before he met Thomas, when he was still riding with the Calverts, before he fully understood the shape of what that meant. He had been a lookout, not a shooter, not a man who stopped a stage with a gun, but a man who had sat on a hillside and given a signal and known what the signal meant. A man had been hurt in the robbery, a passenger who had resisted, and though Benjamin had not been the one who hurt him, Benjamin had been there and had been part of the chain of events. He told her he had ridden away from the Calverts 3 weeks later and had been running from them ever since, and running from the law in addition, because once a warrant was issued with your name on it, the machinery of it did not easily stop. "I'm telling you," he said, "because I don't want you to be standing next to me in Albuquerque and not knowing." She was quiet for a moment. The stars were very bright. "Are you the same man who did that?" she asked. "No," he said. "But the law doesn't make that distinction." "I know it doesn't," she said. "I wasn't asking about the law." He turned to look at her, and for a moment the distance between them on the bench seemed very small, though neither of them had moved. "No," he said again, and this time it was an answer to a different question. They reached Albuquerque the following afternoon. The city had grown considerably since Lydia had last been there, spreading along the Rio Grande with the confidence of a place that believed in its own future. The railroad had brought new buildings, a proper hotel, a courthouse, and the kind of impersonal civic energy that turned raw settlement into something that aspired to permanence. Lydia went to the land office while Benjamin waited outside the city at a small camp they established by the river, a precaution they had agreed on. She presented her case to the land office clerk, a precise, suspicious man named Alderton who clearly expected a widow alone with a stack of maps to be either confused or easily managed, and she was neither. She laid out Thomas's survey notes, the original chain measurements, the bearing records, and the cross-references to the territorial grant maps, and she explained, in the careful and unhurried language of a woman who had spent a winter teaching herself surveying from her dead husband's books, exactly why Harlan Voss's claim to the eastern 12 acres was legally and mathematically without foundation. Alderton had made her repeat herself twice before he began writing things down, and by the end of the appointment, his condescension had modulated into something closer to grudging attention. He told her the challenge would be reviewed within 15 days and that she would receive a written determination. She walked out of the land office into the bright August street feeling something she had not felt in a long time, capable, not just surviving, capable. Benjamin was waiting where she had left him, and when she told him how it had gone he smiled at her, fully this time, not the compressed almost smile she had seen before, and it was the kind of smile that changed a face completely, that revealed what a face looked like when the person wearing it was genuinely happy. She had not seen that before, and it stopped her breath for a moment. "Thomas would have been insufferably proud," he said. "Thomas would have tried to hug me and knocked over the surveying case," she said. They both laughed, and the laughter was warm and real and had Thomas in it without being consumed by Thomas, and something shifted in the air between them that both of them felt and neither of them acknowledged yet. They camped one more night before the return journey, and this time the conversation went on longer, the two of them talking into the darkness about everything, about her childhood in Missouri, about the reasons she had followed Thomas West, about the dream she had for the farm that extended beyond survival into something that resembled a life she actually wanted. He listened with his full attention, and when he asked questions, they were the kind that showed he had been listening to the previous answers. She asked him what he would do if the warrant in Arizona was lifted. It was not an impossible scenario. Men with money could sometimes get legal complications resolved, and the witness to the robbery had died of illness in 1881, which removed the primary case. He was quiet for a while. "I don't know," he said. "I've been running long enough that I don't quite know what not running looks like." "It looks like what you've been doing for the past month," she said. He looked at her. The fire between them was small and warm. "Does it?" he said quietly. She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. They did not say anything more about it that night, but when they made camp and she lay under her blanket looking at the enormous sky above the desert, she stopped pretending she didn't know what she was feeling. She let herself know it fully, and it was frightening and it was real and it was, she thought carefully about the word right. Not comfortable, not convenient, not sensible. Right. The return journey to the farm was different from the outbound trip, in a way she could feel in the air between them, but could not yet name or act on. Something had been admitted in the silence and the fire and the looking at each other, and neither of them had yet figured out what to do with the admission. Back at the farm, the rhythm of work resumed, but it had a different quality, more comfortable, less careful, as though they had stopped performing ease and started actually having it. He had begun, without discussion, to take on the morning feeding as a permanent thing, and she had begun, without discussion, to make enough coffee for two, and the day's tasks were divided by an unspoken negotiation that worked because They both naturally understood what needed doing, and neither had to be told twice. There were moments that accumulated, small and significant. He caught her when she slipped off the top rail of the fence, coming down from mending the top wire, and his hands on her arms were warm and steady, and he set her down carefully on the ground and stepped back immediately with the expression of a man who has touched something he wanted badly not to let go of. She stood and looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, and then she turned back to the fence, and he went back to the post he had been setting, and the moment passed without resolution but left a mark. She found him one afternoon sitting outside the barn with one of Thomas's books, not a surveying book, but a thin volume of poetry that she hadn't known Thomas had kept out there. He had it open and was reading slowly, with the careful attention of someone who did not have easy experience with poetry but was trying to understand it. She stood in the barn doorway and watched him for a moment, his lips moving slightly with the words, completely unaware of being observed. She did not tell him she had seen him, but she thought about it for the rest of the day. The determination from the land office arrived in the third week of August. Harlan Voss's challenge was denied. The boundary stood where Thomas Reed's survey had placed it. The 12 acres were Lydia's. She read the letter standing at the mailbox on the road, and then she walked back to the farm with it in her hand and found Benjamin repairing the hinge on the barn door and held it out to him without saying anything. He read it. He looked up at her. "He was right," Benjamin said. "Thomas was right." "Yes," she said. "About the land." "About the land," she agreed, though they both understood they were talking about more than the land. The trouble arrived in the first days of September, in the form of 2 men on the road who had asked at the general store in Cutter's Bend whether anyone had seen a man matching Benjamin Graves's description in the area. She heard about it from Mrs. Ortega, the wife of a local rancher, who came by with her daughter, and mentioned it with the careful casualness of a neighbor passing along information they thought you'd want to have. The 2 men had Calvert written all over them, though Mrs. Ortega did not know the name. She had simply recognized the type, which was the type of men who asked questions while showing the butt of their gun. Lydia carried this information home and told Benjamin that evening, and the change in him was immediate and familiar. The closing of the careful blankness over his face, the return of the perpetual alertness that she had seen on him when he first arrived and that had gradually unwound over the weeks on the farm. "I need to go," he said. She had known he would say it. She had been preparing herself for it since she heard the news. And yet the word landed like a stone in standing water, sending out rings of cold. "If you go, they follow you," she said. "You don't know where they'll pick up your trail and you'll be alone." "If I stay, I bring that trail here," he said. "That's not a risk I'll put on you." "You don't get to make that decision for me," she said. He looked at her. "Lydia, I mean it," she said. "You don't get to walk out that door to protect me without asking me what I want. That's not protection. That's a different kind of taking something you don't have the right to." The quiet that followed was charged with everything they had not yet said. "What do you want?" he asked, and his voice was careful but his eyes were not. She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him, closer than they had stood before, close enough that she could see the way his jaw tightened with the effort of not reaching for her. "I want you to stop running," she said. "I want you to stay and help me figure out how to solve this so you can stop running. Not because I need the fence mended, because I need you to stop running." The admission hung between them in the lamplight, and she watched it land in him, watched it move through his face like whether first surprise, then a look of naked wanting so unguarded that it made her chest ache, and then something quieter and deeper that looked like a man coming to understand that he has arrived somewhere he did not know he was looking for. "I have no right to feel what I feel about you," he said quietly, "given everything." "Thomas would disagree," she said. "He told you to come to me. He told you to make sure I knew he kept his promise. He put you on a road that ended here." "That's not he knew you," she said. "He knew me. And he sent you here with his mother's ring in a box and a note that said to tell you he trusted you with the things that mattered most to him." She held his gaze. He wasn't talking about the ring. Benjamin was very still. "Stay," she said. "Stay and we figure this out together." He reached up very slowly and touched her face, her cheek, one hand, careful and warm. And she closed her eyes for a moment and felt the whole long weight of 2 years of grief and work and loneliness begin to shift into something else. Not gone, not replaced, but joined by something new that was strong enough to carry the weight alongside it. "I'll stay," he said. They made a plan. Lydia had contacts in Cutter's Bend that Benjamin did not, the shopkeeper Ames, who knew everyone and everything, and Judge Carver, who was a fair man, and had been known to look carefully at cases brought to him, rather than simply applying the convenient interpretation. The warrant against Benjamin in Arizona was, as she had thought about, increasingly fragile. The primary witness was dead, and the men who had filed the original complaint, the stage line owners, had themselves been investigated for insurance fraud in the intervening years, and had more reason to let sleeping dogs lie than to pursue a case. There was also a territorial marshal named Ellis who was, by reputation, a man who cared about the actual truth of things rather than the tidiness of outstanding warrants. He was based in Santa Fe. He was reachable by letter. Lydia wrote the letter. She wrote it at the kitchen table over 2 evenings, Benjamin sitting across from her reading Thomas's surveying books, and she wrote it with the same careful precision she had brought to the land office case, laying out what had actually happened at the stage robbery. His role as a lookout, not a principal, the death of the key witness, the context of his flight from the Calverts, and attaching to it a sworn statement from Benjamin about his own actions and a statement of character that she signed herself. Lydia Reed of Cutter's Bend, New Mexico Territory. She sealed the letter and addressed it and sent it with Ames at the general store, who was traveling to Santa Fe for supplies and had agreed to deliver it personally. Then she and Benjamin waited. The 2 Calvert men showed up at the farm on a Wednesday afternoon in the 2nd week of September. They rode up the track from the road in the early afternoon heat and stopped their horses in the yard, and Lydia came out to meet them on the porch because she had heard them coming and had decided that meeting trouble standing up was better than letting it come to her. They were not impressive men, up close. They had the look of men who are most comfortable when the odds are arranged in their favor, and they had apparently not anticipated that the farm's occupant would come out to meet them with the particular quality of calm that Lydia had, which was not fearlessness exactly but something more practical. The calm of a woman who has already made her plans and executed them and is now simply waiting. "We're looking for a man named Graves," the larger of the 2 said. "A lot of people are looking for a lot of people," Lydia said. "Who are you?" They gave names she did not believe. She let that go. "We heard he might be in this area," the second man said. "This is a working farm," she said. "I've had a hired hand for the summer season. He left 3 days ago heading toward Colorado." She said this with perfect steadiness, looking them both in the eye. "I don't know his final destination." There was a pause while they evaluated her, and she let them look, because she had learned from years of business with difficult men that the best way to survive being read by them was to be utterly boring, no tells, no hesitation, just the flat factual manner of a woman who had answered the question and had nothing more to add. The larger man glanced toward the barn. "You mind if we look around?" "I mind very much," she said pleasantly. "This is private property. I have the deed recorded in Albuquerque if you'd like to verify that. You're welcome to walk to town and ask Judge Carver to issue a search warrant, and when he asks what grounds you're seeking it on and who authorized you to search private property in New Mexico Territory, you can have that conversation." She paused. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" They left. Benjamin had been in the root cellar under the kitchen floor, which she had prepared for exactly this possibility 3 days before. He came up when she rapped on the hatch with her heel, and she told him what had been said, and he stood in the kitchen with his hand on the back of the chair looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before and could not name. "You didn't have to," he started. "I know I didn't," she said, which had become, between them, a kind of private language. She said it gently this time. "I know." He was across the kitchen in 2 strides and she was in his arms, and it was the most natural thing that had ever happened in that house, the warmth and solidity of him. The way he held her like she was something he was profoundly grateful not to have lost, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself be held and felt the last fortress wall of careful distance come down, finally, without violence, simply because it was ready. They stood like that for a long moment. Then she looked up at him and he looked down at her, and the kiss that followed was as inevitable as anything she had ever experienced, unhurried, careful, full of the weight of everything they had both been carrying toward this moment for the past months. And underneath all of that weight, surprisingly, something light and bright that she recognized as the beginning of happiness. October arrived with a cooling in the desert air, and a quality of golden light that Lydia had always thought was the territory's finest season. The farm work shifted to its autumn rhythm, the last of the harvest put by, the equipment cleaned and stored, the preparations for winter undertaken with the thorough attention that kept a farm alive through the cold months. Benjamin worked through all of it as he had worked through all the other work, with focus and competence, and now there was the additional element of ease between them. The ease of two people who have said the important things and are no longer bracing against the saying of them. Marshall Ellis's response arrived in late October. It was thorough and careful and took the shape of a man who had looked at the case file, reviewed the statement, and applied the kind of rigorous logic to it that distinguished him from most of the law enforcement in the territory. He noted that the primary evidence for the Arizona warrant was now fatally weakened by the death of the key witness. He noted that the Calvert outfit, which had provided supplementary testimony in the original case, was itself currently under investigation for a series of crimes in Texas, and that the credibility of their statements was therefore compromised. He noted that the secondary count, for which the evidence was more circumstantial, could be resolved by a formal surrender and proceeding before a federal judge in Albuquerque, at which point he was prepared to recommend to the court that the charge be considered in light of the changed evidentiary situation. In plain language, if Benjamin Graves came to Albuquerque and stood before the court, Marshall Ellis believed the case would be dismissed. It was not a certainty. It was a chance, a real and professionally supported chance, from a man who did not offer such things lightly. Benjamin read the letter 3 times. Then he looked up at Lydia across the table. "He's offering me a way out," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you going to take it?" He looked at the letter again. She could see him weighing it, the risk, the fear, the unfamiliar possibility of actually being free, which was its own kind of terrifying when you had spent years organized around the opposite. "If I walk into that courthouse and it goes wrong," he started. "It won't," she said. "Ellis is a straight man. I've asked about him. He doesn't make offers he doesn't intend to keep." "You've asked about him?" "Since I sent the letter," she said. "I've been asking anyone who would know." She met his eyes. "I'm not going to send you into a room blind. I have checked this from every direction I can check it. The offer is real." He was quiet for a long moment. "You did all that," he said. "Of course I did," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. His thumb traced across her knuckles with the careful attention he brought to everything, and she felt the warmth of it run all the way up her arm. "All right," he said. "I'll go." They traveled to Albuquerque together on a clear November morning, the desert already showing its winter palette of dusty gold and pale brown, and the vivid blue of the sky above. Lydia wore her good gray dress and her winter coat, and she carried the document case again, which contained copies of the marshal's letter and the supporting statements, and every piece of paper she had assembled over the past weeks. Benjamin wore a clean coat she had purchased for him in Cutter's Bend, which he had protested and she had ignored, and they arrived at the federal courthouse in Albuquerque on the morning of the proceeding without incident. Marshall Ellis was exactly what his letters had suggested. A compact, precise man of about 50 with thoughtful eyes and a manner that spoke of long experience with the full range of human behavior. He met them outside the courthouse and shook Lydia's hand first, which was not the convention but which she noted with approval. "Mrs. Reed," he said, "your letter was one of the most thorough documents I've received in 20 years of this work." "The case warranted thoroughness," she said. He looked at Benjamin. "Graves." "Marshal," Benjamin said, "let's go in." The proceeding was presided over by a federal judge named Hartwell, who was known for the economy of his courtroom manner, meaning he had very little patience for anything that was not directly relevant and a great deal of patience for anything that was. He heard Ellis's presentation of the evidentiary changes, read the statements, asked 3 sharp questions, and made a ruling that was clean and unambiguous. The primary warrant was dismissed on evidentiary grounds. The secondary count was resolved by a fine that Lydia had quietly prepared for, with money from the savings Thomas had left, and the terms of which included no further action against Benjamin Graves in Arizona Territory, provided no new criminal conduct was established within 5 years. It was over in 40 minutes. They stood on the steps of the federal courthouse in Albuquerque, New Mexico Territory, in the November sunshine, and Benjamin stood perfectly still for a moment with the expression of a man who has been braced against a blow for so long that the removal of the threat has not yet fully registered. "It's done," Lydia said. He turned to look at her. The light was bright and even, and she could see his face completely, all of it, without the shadow of running or hiding or carrying something dark and sharp for long enough that you forgot it was there. "It's done," he said. She took his hand and he held it, and they stood there on the courthouse steps in the November light, and she felt, with complete clarity, that this was the beginning of something rather than the continuation of something, and that the beginning was exactly right. They went back to the farm. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way that good things are quiet, not empty but full of the ordinary, extraordinary texture of a life being built. Benjamin was no longer in the barn. That had shifted after Albuquerque, with the naturalness of 2 people who have decided on each other, and see no reason to pretend otherwise. There were still the things to figure out, the shape of what they were to each other, the question of what came next, the way you built a life with someone when you were both carrying loss and hard history, and the specific kind of toughness that survival requires. But they built it. Day by day, the way everything on the frontier was built, incrementally, steadily, with attention to what actually worked and willingness to change what didn't. On a cold evening in December, with the first winter storm gathering behind the western mesa and the stove burning, and the lamps lit against the early dark, Benjamin pulled something from his coat pocket and set it on the table between them. It was the thin gold ring from the box, his mother's ring, the one Thomas had meant to give her with a speech he never wrote. "Thomas left it for you," he said, "but I've been thinking about what he said in the letter, about keeping promises." He looked at her, and his voice was steady, but his eyes were the eyes of a man who is taking the largest risk of his life, which for this particular man was saying something. "I'm not asking you to forget him. I'm not asking you to replace anything. I'm asking you if you think there's a future here that we could build together, properly, if you want that." Lydia looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about Thomas, who had trusted this man enough to send him to her, who had written a letter that ended with "tell him he was trusted with the things that matter most," and she thought about the months since Benjamin had appeared on her porch with a box and no right to have it, and all the things they had been to each other since. She picked up the ring and placed it on her own finger on her right hand, not her left. "Ask me again in spring," she said. "When the fence is mended and the planting's done and we've gotten through a winter together." He looked at her hand and then at her face, and the compressed almost smile came back, but larger this time, fuller, the real one. "All right," he said. The winter was hard in the way New Mexico winters could be hard, not the bone-cracking cold of the northern plains, but a relentless cold with wind that found every gap in a structure and a loneliness that the desert enforced during the months when travel was difficult. The farm was its own world in those months, and its world contained the 2 of them, and they learned each other through the winter with the intimacy of shared space and shared work, and the long evenings that needed filling. She taught him to read the surveying instruments properly. He taught her a card game that Thomas had apparently never learned from him, which she won twice in 3 tries, prompting a look of impressed disbelief that she found entirely satisfying. She read to him sometimes in the evenings from the books on the shelf, and he had an instinct for the ones he liked before she opened them, which delighted her. He repaired the kitchen window that had been letting in cold air through a failed seal since the previous winter, and when she mentioned that she had been trying to fix that seal for 8 months, he said, with perfectly straight face, that it had needed a different kind of attention, and she threw the dish towel at him with a laugh that rang through the whole house. He talked more as the winter went on. Not the careful, measured speech of the man who had arrived on her porch, but a fuller voice, one that had opinions and humor and the particular rhythm of a person who is becoming, with some surprise, comfortable. She loved to listen to him think through a problem, the methodical way he examined a thing from its edges inward, and she loved to argue with him when she thought he was wrong, which happened regularly, and she loved the way he argued back without yielding until she had actually made her case, which was more respectful than most men she had encountered. She wrote to his sister in Kansas. She had found the address in an old letter in Benjamin's coat pocket. He had been carrying it for 2 years, she thought, the same way he had carried Thomas's key, as a connection he was not ready to release. She wrote to say that her brother was well and free and settled in New Mexico territory, and that she hoped the distance between them might be shortened, and she signed it Lydia Reed, who keeps the farm where your brother has found a home. Benjamin found out when the reply came 3 weeks later. He sat at the table reading it with a stillness that was different from his usual stillness, softer, somehow more open. His sister's name was Clara, and she wrote well, and she was, evidently, a woman who had been waiting for exactly this news for a long time. "You had no right to do that," he said, looking up from the letter. "I know I didn't," she said. He looked at her with the full weight of everything he felt, which was considerable and which he was still learning to show, and she held his gaze and let him look. "Thank you," he said. Spring came with the drama that the territory always brought to it, sudden and vivid after the gray of winter, the desert blooming in improbable color, the air losing its edge and taking on the warmth that felt like a personal gift after the cold months. The farm responded to the season the way it always did, making its demands with renewed energy, and Lydia and Benjamin answered those demands with the practiced efficiency of 2 people who have spent a winter learning how to work together without stepping on each other. The fence was mended. The planting was done. A morning in early April came clear and warm, and after breakfast Benjamin looked at her across the table and said, "It's spring." She looked at him. "So it is." He pulled something from his shirt pocket and placed it on the table. A ring. Not the thin gold band from Thomas's box, which she still wore on her right hand, but a different one, a simple, solid band that had clearly been made by the silversmith in Cutter's Bend, modest and well-made, the kind of thing a man buys when he has saved carefully and chosen thoughtfully. "I bought it in February," he said. "I was waiting for spring." She looked at the ring and then at him, and the morning light came through the kitchen window and fell across his face with the particular generous quality of spring light, showing everything clearly, and what it showed was a man she trusted absolutely. A man who had kept his promise to a dying friend and then come back and kept his promise to her, and was now, in the best possible way, asking to keep making them. She moved the thin gold band from her right hand to her right ring finger where it would stay as Thomas's memory, and she held out her left hand. He put the silver ring on her finger. It fit perfectly, which should not have surprised her because he was a man who paid attention to details, but it moved her anyway. "Benjamin Graves," she said. "Lydia Reed," he said. "Yes," she said. He stood up from the table and she stood up, and he kissed her in the morning light with the spring coming through the window and the farm quiet around them, and it was nothing like she had imagined love would feel the second time. It was better, different, fuller, a thing that had grown from loss and honesty and hard work and chosen trust, and was stronger for all of those roots. They were married in June in Cutter's Bend, at the small whitewashed church that served the scattered settlers of the area. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Adams, who was a direct and unsentimental man who nonetheless cried briefly at the exchange of vows, which Lydia thought spoke well of the vows. There were perhaps 20 people present: neighbors, the Ortegas from the Road Ranch, Mrs. Alderton from the general store and her husband, Judge Carver with his wife, and a young woman who had come on the stage from Kansas the week before, tall and clear-eyed with Benjamin's same deliberate manner, who was Clara Graves, now Clara Whitfield, who had come a long way to see her brother married and had arrived with a letter she put directly into Benjamin's hands and watched his face as he read it. Clara had written to Marshall Ellis on her own, Lydia would later learn, adding her voice to the record of her brother's character. She had also, apparently, written to the stage company in Arizona, now under different management, and the combination of these letters plus Ellis's original recommendation had resulted in a formal clearing of Benjamin's name from the territorial records. He was, as of the week of his wedding, legally a free man in every territory of the Southwest. The wedding celebration was held on the farm, in the yard under a late June sky, with food that the neighbors had contributed and a fiddle player from town, and a quality of joy that Lydia had not expected to feel so completely. A happiness that was not innocent, not unmarked by what had come before, but made richer by the knowledge of what it had cost to arrive at it. She danced with Benjamin in the yard with the first stars appearing above the mesa, and he danced with the careful deliberateness of a man who had clearly not had much practice, but was paying close attention, and she laughed at his concentration, and he looked mock-wounded and then laughed too, and Clara watched them from near the fence with the expression of a woman seeing something she had hoped for finally happening. They went into their first night as a married couple with the house quiet around them and the summer outside the window, and Lydia thought, as she lay in the dark listening to the desert breathe, that the house had a different quality now. Not empty where it had been empty. Not trying to be what it had been before. Simply full in its own right, with its own life. The first year of their marriage was a year of building and settling, the kind of deep-rootedness that comes when two people stop performing permanence and start actually having it. Benjamin filed for a homesteader's claim on 20 additional acres adjacent to the original 40, a piece of land to the north that had been unused, and that the Territorial Land Office approved without complication. The additional land meant more crops the following year, and a diversification into cattle that he managed with the horse skills the Calverts had taught him, which was one of the stranger ironies of his life, using what bad men had taught him in the service of something good. Lydia's surveying had grown beyond the bounds of the farm by that point. Judge Carver had referred her to 2 neighboring disputes that needed professional resolution, and she had handled both with the precision and impartiality that made people trust her work. By the fall of the first year, she had a small but genuine practice as the area's most reliable surveyor, which generated income beyond the farm and built a reputation that spread in the way reputations spread in small communities, quietly and surely. They argued sometimes, as people who are genuinely honest with each other will argue. They argued about money. She was more careful with it than he was, not because she was stingy, but because she had lived too close to the edge to be comfortable with slack. About the pace of the northern land development, he wanted to move faster than she thought prudent. And once, memorably, about a horse he bought without discussing it first, a fine-looking bay gelding that was in fact exceptionally bad-tempered, which she thought proved her point about the consulting, and he thought proved his point about the horse's potential. And they were both right, and neither of them conceded gracefully. But it was resolved eventually, and the horse turned out acceptably manageable after about 6 months of Benjamin's patient attention. In the spring of their second year together, Lydia told him she was pregnant. He was in the middle of repairing the north fence gate, and she had walked out with the coffee he hadn't come back to collect, and she told him standing at the gate with the spring morning around them, and he stood very still for a moment in the way she had come to understand was not absence but the opposite full presence, processing something deeply. Then he said, "Are you all right? How are you feeling?" "Fine," she said. "Better than fine, actually." He looked at her. Then he put down the hammer very carefully on the fence post and came to her and held her face in both hands and looked at her for a long moment with the look she thought of privately as his fullest look, the one that held everything he felt without editing. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, laughing. "All right," meaning yes, meaning good, meaning he stopped. "I don't have the word for what I mean." "I think the word is happy," she said. "Yes," he said. "That." Their son was born in October of 1884, on a night of clear cold stars with the midwife Mrs. Torres and Clara, who had visited twice more since the wedding and had become, gradually and genuinely, a real presence in their lives, present in the house. He was a strong, loud-voiced infant who arrived in the world with opinions about it, which Lydia felt was exactly right for a child of the two of them. They named him Thomas Benjamin Graves, Thomas for the man who had made them possible, Benjamin for his father and Mrs. Torres recorded both names carefully in the register of births she maintained for the Cutter's Bend area, and Lydia held her son in the hours after dawn, and felt the circular completion of something grief and love and time and the particular mercy of the frontier, which broke things, and then, sometimes, gave you the raw material to build something new. Benjamin sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at their son with the expression she would come to think of as the third fullest look behind the one he gave her, and the one he gave the land in the early morning, the look of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was going and finds it, to his profound surprise, exactly right. "He looks like you," she said. "He looks like a very angry potato," Benjamin said. "That's exactly what I said." Clara laughed from across the room, and even Mrs. Torres smiled, and the October morning came through the window with the golden light of the territory's finest season. Little Thomas was a willful, curious child who grew up knowing the land the way children who grow up on working farms do, with both the poetic and the practical, the beauty of the mesa in the late light, and the reality of the work it required. He followed his father through the daily rounds of the farm with the intense attention of a small person for whom everything is new, and Benjamin showed him things with a patience that Lydia found moving in proportion to how well she understood what it cost him. The patience of a man who had not had a patient teacher himself, and was consciously deciding to be different. By the time Thomas was 2, the farm had become what it had always potentially been, a proper operation. 60 acres under management, a small herd of 20 cattle, the surveying practice. The house expanded by the addition of a second bedroom that Benjamin had built himself over the winter, plank by plank, with Thomas watching from a safe distance and commenting with the authority of a child who has opinions but no relevant experience. Clara came to stay for 3 months in 1886, and during that stay, the letters between her and her husband in Kansas revealed that they were considering a move west, that the territory offered the kind of fresh start that Kansas no longer had for them. By the end of that visit, she and Lydia had become the kind of friends who finish each other's sentences, which Benjamin found both heartwarming and slightly alarming. In the spring of 1887, Lydia told Benjamin she was pregnant again. This time he was at the kitchen table when she told him, and he did not stand still for a long moment but instead stood up immediately and crossed the kitchen and held her. And she felt the warmth and steadiness of him and thought, not for the first time, about the strange and specific road that had brought them to this kitchen, and this morning, and this life. Their second child was a daughter, born in November of 1887, on a day when the first snow of the season was just barely sugaring the top of the western mesa. They named her Clara Rose Graves, for Benjamin's sister who had come from Kansas the month before to be present, and Rose for the wild roses that grew along the farm's northern fence line every June, which Lydia had always loved. Clara wept when she heard the name, and denied it with vehemence, and then wept again when she held the baby, and Benjamin watched his sister with an expression of such warm, complete happiness that Lydia had to look away, because it was too much to hold without crying herself. The winter of 1887 to 1888 was the winter that Lydia would remember in later years as the winter they became, fully and finally, what they had been building toward since a man with a frayed collar and hollow eyes had appeared on her porch with a box he had no right to keep. Not that every difficulty was resolved or every wound fully healed. Those things take longer than 5 years, and she knew that, and she did not expect perfection from life or from the man she had married. But the winter had the quality of something settled in the way a foundation settles, not shifting, not uncertain, simply there. They sat on the porch some evenings when the children were asleep and the desert was doing its winter quiet, and the stars were the enormous sharp-edged stars of the territory, and she sometimes thought of Thomas, his specific goodness, his stubbornness, his hawk with the broken wing, with a love that was clear and complete, no longer sharp, the kind of memory that holds its shape without cutting. She thought he would have liked this life. She thought he would have been insufferably smug about being right about Benjamin. Benjamin knew she thought about Thomas. He did not ask, and she did not have to explain, because one of the things she had come to love most about him was his understanding that the past was not competition. He carried his own past with the same understanding, not as a weight to be shed but as the ground from which the present grew and which gave the present its particular specific meaning. "I want to tell you something," he said one evening, the children asleep inside, the winter stars very bright above the mesa. "Tell me," she said. "When I knocked on your door with that box," he said, "I thought the best outcome was that you'd take it and not shoot me," she laughed. "I considered both options. I know you did." He looked at her. "I had no idea. I couldn't have imagined this, any of it." "Neither could I," she said honestly. "I just want you to know that I know," he said, "what I have, what this is." He gestured, a small movement that contained the house, the farm, the dark desert, the sleeping children, the whole particular life they had made. "I don't take it for granted." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was warm and solid and smelled like winter air and the faint cedar of his coat, and she thought about the box on the porch floor and the hollow-eyed man who had no right to have it, and the strange mercy of a dead man who had known both of them well enough to send one to the other with a key and a trust and a note about promises kept. "Thomas was right about you," she said. "He was right about most things," Benjamin said. "He was right about this one especially," she said. The wind came off the mesa with the cold breath of the deeper winter to come, and they sat together in the last of the evening, watching the stars over Cutter's Bend, New Mexico Territory, 1888, and the farm was behind them, and the life they had built was around them and ahead, was all the ordinary, extraordinary days of a life that had been made from grief and honesty, and the kind of love that comes from choosing someone not in spite of the hard things, but with full knowledge of them. The following spring, when the wild roses bloomed along the northern fence line, and little Thomas was 4 years old, and running through the fields with the purposeful energy of a child for whom the world is entirely his own, and baby Clara was in her basket on the porch in the warm morning light, and the 60 acres were green with the promise of a good harvest, and Benjamin was at the north fence doing the thing he always did in April, which was check the posts for winter damage. Lydia brought him his coffee and stood beside him in the spring morning, and he took the coffee and looked at her and said, "All right," in the way that meant all of it, the farm and the children and the life in her. "All right," she said, meaning yes, meaning good. He smiled at her with the real smile, the full one, and the spring light was on both of them, and the fence was in good repair, and the horses were in the south pasture, and the children were alive and well, and somewhere Thomas Reed was, she believed, insufferably satisfied. She took Benjamin's free hand and they stood together at the north fence in the April morning, and the territory was vast and bright in theirs. And life, which had broken open in the worst possible way, and then, against all reasonable expectation, put itself back together into something better than either of them had known to want, went on.